passenger jet is coming down through a clear European night. Below, the Baltic Sea looks calm, with ships scattered across it. Up in the cockpit, it's the kind of approach pilots have done 1,000 times, until the map on their screens suddenly blanks out. The GPS signal is gone. Down at sea level, you see the same kind of thing in a different way. A cargo ship's electronic chart might show a perfectly straight line, like the vessel drove right across an airport runway it never went near, then cut through fields and even a nuclear plant on the coast, before snapping back to its real position. Most passengers wouldn't notice anything. Phones still work, apps still open, but in the background, the location and timing data those systems depend on is being distorted, or just disappearing. Something is jamming GPS over Europe, and when researchers chased the pattern back to its source, they found something no one was really expecting. Take a real example. A Finnair flight heading to Tartu, a small city in Estonia, in April 2024. It's a normal spring evening. The city lights are coming into view. The approach into Tartu is modern, built around satellite navigation instead of the older, radio beam-style guidance. Then, right as the plane starts down, the system throws a warning. The GPS guidance the crew is expecting isn't there, so they do what they're trained to do. They abandon the approach, climb away, and go back to Helsinki. A few days later, it happens again on another flight. And then Finnair makes an unusual call. It suspends flights to Tartu for a month, specifically because GPS interference made that satellite-based landing procedure unreliable. Around the same time, ships in the Baltic Sea and Black Sea start reporting strange track lines. Massive vessels apparently traveling over land, through deserts, or straight across runways. Analysts tie a lot of these odd tracks to areas that are already known for heavy GPS jamming. And across Northern Europe, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Northern Poland, pilots file more reports of navigation dropping out or showing impossible positions, especially near the borders with Russia and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. Finland's transport agency publicly confirms there's been a rise in interference reports in and near its airspace in 2024. On the ground, most people won't feel this. Phones can quietly fall back to cell towers or other systems. But for aircraft and ships that increasingly depend on satellite navigation, it's more than a minor inconvenience. It's a real-world stress test of the invisible infrastructure that keeps travel and trade moving. So what's actually jamming GPS over Europe? Is it deliberate? Accidental? Military spillover? And how do you even track something you can't see? Just radio energy in the air. The first clue is that this isn't random. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, aviation and maritime authorities have documented a big increase in interference with satellite navigation signals, GNSS, short for Global Navigation Satellite Systems, across Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Pilots report losing GPS near conflict zones and along the edges of Russian airspace. Latvia's communications authority publicly identifies hotspots of interference along its borders with Kaliningrad, Leningrad, and Pskov, areas that host major Russian military bases. In January 2024, the EU Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, updates a bulletin warning airlines that jamming and spoofing are increasing and that it can degrade key communication, navigation, and surveillance systems on board aircraft. And the International Air Transport Association compiles data from airlines globally. Its 2024 safety report records more than 430,000 cases of GNSS jamming and spoofing affecting commercial flights in that year alone. On the face of it, the obvious explanation is electronic warfare. Modern militaries use ground-based jammers to protect important bases and cities from GPS-guided weapons and drones. The idea is simple. Blast powerful noise on the same frequencies the navigation satellites use, so receivers can't pick out the real signals. Russian forces have used these techniques in and around Ukraine and Syria for years, and researchers have traced many of the interference bubbles in the Baltic region back toward Kaliningrad and other Russian military sites. But there's a problem. Not all of the interference looks like it's coming from the ground. Analysts started noticing rare, intense events where GNSS receivers across almost all of Europe seem to get hit at nearly the same moment. Signal quality drops from multiple satellites, it lasts just a few seconds, and then it's gone. When you look at long-term data logs, these show up like synchronized blips, quick dips that happen across huge distances at the same time. A ground-based jammer can wipe out GPS across a city, or even a big chunk of a country. What it can't do is cause the same sudden disturbance thousands of kilometers apart, all at once. That suggests something else is going on, something above Europe. To understand why, it helps to boil GPS down to basics. GPS and other systems like Europe's Galileo, Russia's GLONASS, and China's BeiDou are essentially networks of very accurate clocks in space. Each satellite broadcasts a timestamp and its position. Your phone, car, or an aircraft navigation computer listens to several satellites and measures tiny differences in signal arrival time. Since radio waves travel at the speed of light, those tiny timing differences can be turned into a position. The catch is that by the time these signals travel about 20,000 kilometers from orbit, they're extremely weak, often below natural background noise. Receivers pull them out by doing a lot of signal processing over time. That's why jamming works. If the satellite signal is already barely there, it doesn't take much interference on the right frequency to drown it out. Jamming is basically overwhelming the receiver with noise so it can't hear the satellites. Spoofing goes further. It transmits fake navigation signals that look real, tricking the receiver into calculating the wrong position. And because civilian GNSS signals are open and unencrypted, it's possible to build equipment that can mess with them. Most of it is low power and local. Military-grade systems are not. Ground-based jammers explain a lot of the day-to-day GPS trouble pilots and ship captains report near conflict zones and sensitive borders. But they still don't explain those continent-wide, seconds-long events. In late 2024, a GPS researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, Professor Todd Humphreys, gets a tip. Someone had spotted a handful of days buried in public monitoring data where GPS signal, strength across Europe, drops in a distinctive pattern, then recovers, again and again. Humphreys and his student, Zach Clements, start digging into it, using data from networks of reference stations, fixed GPS receivers in places like Amsterdam and Trondheim that log raw satellite signals for technical and scientific use. Here's the key method. If an interference burst hits one station slightly before another, that time difference can be used to narrow down where it came from. It's the same basic idea as using the delay between thunder heard in different places to figure out where the lightning struck. At first, the estimates jump around, but as they refine their approach, using a received power-based detection framework and time difference of arrival analysis for these wide area events, a clearer picture forms. The source doesn't fit a ground location. The best match traces a path high above Earth in a long, stretched orbit over the northern hemisphere, a Molniya orbit. And that's an orbit associated with Russia's EKS early warning satellites, which are designed to watch for missile launches over high northern latitudes. Looking across years of data, from 2019 to 2026, they identify scores of these events. Each one lasts only a few seconds. But during those seconds, GNSS receivers across Europe, Greenland, and parts of Canada see signal-to-noise ratios drop sharply by up to around 10 decibels on major civilian navigation frequencies. And it isn't just GPS. The affected frequencies are used by Galileo and BeiDou too. Russia's GLONASS, which uses a different band, looks largely unaffected. That combination, an interference source in a high-inclination Russian orbit that degrades multiple non-Russian systems while leaving GLONASS mostly alone, points in a pretty specific direction. By matching the timing of the bursts with known satellite orbits, Humphreys and his colleagues conclude with high confidence that the interference is coming from a network of Russian early warning satellites. Their work is published in 2026 under the title Chasing Lightning, and independent researchers at a European navigation firm corroborate it. The takeaway is blunt. Space-based GNSS interference has been reaching Europe for years, even if most people never noticed it. What those satellites are doing and why is still not clear. One possibility is that it's an intentional capability test, because from space, a transmitter can potentially affect receivers across a huge area. Another possibility is that a different payload or communication system on board is unintentionally leaking energy into GNSS bands. Some experts also point out it would be unusual for Russia to risk compromising strategically important early warning satellites by using them as weapons, which makes side effect a plausible explanation. Russia hasn't publicly explained the purpose of the transmissions. The EU has reportedly investigated, but whatever it found is classified. What isn't in doubt is the effect, for a few seconds at a time, on dozens of occasions since 2019, a Russian satellite signal has been strong enough to noticeably degrade, or briefly deny, GNSS reception across much of Europe. So there are really two overlapping stories here. Closer to the ground, military jammers near borders and conflict zones create persistent pockets of GPS denial, an ongoing hazard in parts of the Baltic, Black Sea, and Eastern Mediterranean. And above that, in orbit, a handful of Russian early warning satellites appear to be producing brief bursts that wash interference over entire regions. Now, back to what this looks like in the cockpit. An airliner isn't blindly following GPS. It's constantly cross-checking satellite navigation, ground-based radio aids, inertial sensors that measure movement, and guidance from air traffic control. When GNSS fails, crews switch to those backups. EASA has stressed that flying remains safe, but airlines need to plan for outages, brief crews, and be ready to revert to non-satellite procedures. That's exactly what played out with Finnair and Tartu, where flights were suspended while a radio-based approach was installed. Most of the time, jamming is an operational headache, not a disaster, but it does shrink the margin for error. Interference has been suspected in several close calls and at least one recent air crash outside Europe, and analysts warn that if pilots are already dealing with weather or technical issues, losing a key navigation and timing source, even briefly, can make tough situations harder. And navigation is only the most visible part. A lot of modern life is synchronized by GNSS timing. Cell towers, stock exchanges, power grids, and data centers use satellite timing to keep systems aligned down to fractions of a microsecond. An EU briefing note has estimated that about 10% of the EU's GDP directly depends on GNSS-based services, including logistics, agriculture, finance, and telecommunications. That's why European institutions are treating this as more than just GPS acting up. EASA and IATA have a joint action plan calling for real-time interference monitoring, improved pilot training, and hardware upgrades, like multi-band, multi-constellation receivers that can shift to whatever satellites and frequencies are still usable. The European Commission's Joint Research Center is working on what's TAIN, that's a timing backbone for Europe, combining satellite and terrestrial sources, so being critical infrastructure can keep operating even when GNSS is compromised. EU member states and the European Space Agency are funding Navis projects aimed at alternatives and backups, stronger terrestrial radio networks, positioning using 5G signals, and even techniques that use subtle variations in Earth's magnetic field. And there's even a comeback story here. LORAN, the old long-range radio navigation system, is being reconsidered in an updated eLORAN form. Germany, for example, has been testing eLORAN as part of its PNT resilience work, because low-frequency signals like that are much harder to jam over wide areas than GNSS. The direction of travel is pretty clear. The future isn't one perfect navigation system. It's layers. Multiple satellite constellations, multiple frequencies, in terrestrial backups and smarter systems that constantly check one source against another and flag anything that doesn't make sense. So where does that leave the original question? On the ground, European regulators and military analysts are increasingly direct. Jamming and spoofing are now treated as counter-space capabilities used by some non-EU states, part of a broader competition over space and information. In the Baltic and other border regions, Baltic and Nordic governments routinely point to Russia as the source of much of the interference. Russian officials, when they comment, tend to frame it as defensive, meant to protect key locations from attack. In space, the newer research stays more careful. Humphreys and his co-authors present strong evidence that Russian early warning satellites have been emitting bursts that, intentionally or not, can significantly degrade GPS and other GNSS services across Europe for a few seconds at a time. What isn't publicly known is whether this is deliberate jamming, a misconfigured system, or some other kind of transmission that happens to spill into the same frequency neighborhood as navigation signals. But the big picture is already changing how Europe thinks about GPS. No single system can be treated as an untouchable source of truth anymore. For years, GPS felt like a free utility that just worked. But its weakness is built into the physics. The signals are faint by the time they reach Earth, which means the right interference can knock them out without touching a single computer system. That's the reality Europe is being forced to plan around. Airlines training for sudden GNSS loss, engineers building equipment that can handle bad or missing signals, and governments investing in backups and resilience. Because in the end, the goal isn't to pretend navigation will never fail. It's to be ready when it does, by having other ways to verify where you are, other ways to keep time, and procedures that still work when the satellites go quiet for a few seconds.